I've had an intriguing relationship with Apple throughout my life. It all originated with my iPhone 4S, but more importantly, Monster Legends. You see, I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I didn't apprehend that cloud backup was a thing, and so I saved all the data on the actual 4S. Anywho, I somehow convinced myself to upgrade to the iPhone 5S. At that time, I was an enormous iOS fanboy, believe it or not. Then, in 6th grade, came along a very interesting series of events. My friend had an Android device. I forgot what exact brand it was, but it was pretty darn good. He showed me how customizable Android was, how much more affordable the phones were, emulation, and so much more. This impressed me in 6th grade, and I used the OnePlus One as my secondary phone. Later on that year, my OnePlus One broke because I accidentally dropped it while I ran into a trash can, and I don't recollect what happened to the iPhone 5S. So in the second half of 6th grade, I purchased the Huawei Honor 8. It had a 5.2-inch 1080p IPS display with Gorilla Glass 3, a Kirin 950 chip paired with 4 gigs of RAM, 32 gigs of storage, a dual 12-megapixel camera system that could record 1080p 60fps videos, an 8-megapixel front camera, 3000 milliamps for its battery, which is larger than some mobile devices as of right now. Google Pixel 4. And was rocking Android 6 and can be upgraded to Android 8. So yeah, you can tell it's a dated phone, but there are 3 essential things we can take away from this. The first is that it scored about 2.5 times higher than the 5S in Geekbench, making it a very large upgrade hardware-wise. The second is that it was rocking Android, which would be crucial for the remainder of my life. The last is that this phone was pretty damn sexy. Oof, that glass back was just so beautiful. But it just grew more and more on me, and then I got the S8 the very next year, which I still have to this date. As of right now, I'm debating between the OnePlus 7T Pro and the S10 Plus for my next upgrade. Anywho, from 8th grade till about a few months ago, I had a hatred for Apple. But it wasn't salubrious, and because almost anything they released, I would have resentment towards it. Keep in mind that this is when the iPhone 8, the competing device for, the S8, was 1.5 times more powerful than the S8. That year was the jump from the A10 Fusion chip to the A11 Bionic chip. The Bionic chips were so much better than the Fusion chips. The Bionic chips completely revamped the mobile CPU market and pushed ahead of Android CPUs until now with the release of the 855 Plus, and with that, let's kick this off with their iMacs. The 21-inch iMacs are a bust, as you get less performance and a worse display than the iMac 27-inch, for a little price difference. With this, we'll jump straight into the 27-inch iMac. For $1,799, you get a 5K 500-nit display, a 4.1 boost clock, 6-core 8th Gen i5 CPU, 8 gigs of 2666 MHz RAM, 1 TB of Fusion Drive storage, which is what Apple denominates as a hybrid drive, a Radeon Pro 570X, and your Apple mouse and keyboard. This is a pretty good deal because if you were to get a 5K display, it would run you about $1,300. So for our build, we're rocking a Ryzen 5 2600, 8 gigs of 2800 MHz RAM, a 1 TB 7200 RPM hard drive, and an XFX RX 570. And the monitor is a 49-inch curved 5K display that is on par with the iMac's display. Here's the deal with the 2600X in comparison to the iMac's processor. I'm convinced that the iMac's processor is the i5 9400F because the 9400F is a 6-core 6-thread CPU that boosts to 4.1 GHz. The Ryzen 2600X is a 6-core 12-thread CPU that boosts clocks to 4.2 GHz. This paired with the slightly worse IPC performance in comparison to Intel, since it is, after all, 2nd-gen Ryzen, makes it a tad bit slower in single, dual, and quad-core performance. However, the Ryzen 2600X does perform better in octa-core tasks. This makes it a better desktop for workstation uses, and it makes the 9400F a better gaming CPU, but let's keep in mind we're trying to rival a Mac, not a gaming-based system. Everything is roughly the same, except for the GPU. Our RX 570 performs about 1.3 times better than the Radeon RX 570X. And with this system, it costs about $7 less than the iMac, so the iMac is actually a pretty damn good for what the price is. Then we move on to the more expensive iMac Pro. This is where the stereotypical bad apple comes to play. The best option for the price costs around $8,349. For this price, you get the 5K display, 500 nits brightness, a 4.5 GHz turbo clock, 10-core Xeon chip, 128 gigs of 2666 MHz ECC RAM, 1TB of SSD storage, Radeon Pro Vega 64 with 16 gigs of HBM2 memory, and your mouse and keyboard. Now the benefits for the Xeon chip is the quad-channel memory in addition to ECC support. So for our build, we have the i9-9960X, a 14nm, 16-core, 32-thread, 4.5 GHz boost clock CPU, which is paired with the 128 gigs of 3600 MHz RAM. That's non-ECC, because the 9960X doesn't support ECC RAM. And the biggest difference between the 9960X and the iMac Pro is ECC supports. But the 9960X also supports quad-channel memory, so the only real thing you're missing out here is ECC support. So ECC stands for Error Correction Code and is mainly used in servers and other systems used that require high-value data because of its ability to protect against corrupted data by detecting and correcting memory errors. As this would most likely not be the use case for the iMac, ECC memory doesn't hold much value over non-ECC memory in our scenario. We then have a 4TB 7200 RPM hard drive, and it's booted via the Samsung 970 EVO Plus 1TB M.2 NVMe SSD, which gets up to 3500 megabytes per second read and 3300 megabytes per second write speeds. For our GPU, we have the Quadro RTX 6000. The Quadro RTX is roughly 69% more powerful than the Radeon Pro Vega 64. Not only is it a much more powerful GPU, but if you want to do some gaming, then you would also be set. Although I don't know why you would want to game on this machine, but if you wanted to, you could. The Quadro is about 67% faster in gaming, so it is an incredible card. This is because it has 4,608 CUDA cores, 576 tensor cores, 72 RT cores, 24 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM, 10 gig arrays per second raycast performance, 16.3 teraflops FP32 performance, and consumes 295 watts of power. To put this into perspective, the RTX 2080 Ti has 4,352 CUDA cores, 10 gig array per second raycast, 11 gigs of GDDR6 VRAM, and only consumes 35 watts less than the RTX 6000. This makes the RTX 6000 a great desktop card, especially for the price. Oh, and we still have a 5K display. All of this costs $7,166.63, which is considerably cheaper than the iMac Pro. So it looks like the iMac Pro isn't very pro after all. Onto their MacBooks. Let's kick this off with their cheaper variant, the MacBook Air. For $12.99, you get a 1.6 GHz base clock with a 3.6 GHz boost clock, dual-core i5, 8 gigs of 2133 MHz LP DDR3 RAM, 256 gigs of SSD storage, integrated graphics, and 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports. The display is a 2560 by 1600 IPS display. There isn't a big difference between the 2560 by 1600 and 2560 by 1440, so what you really want to look at is the pixel density and the size of the screens, because that will really affect how it will look. Again, it should be worth mentioning that the configurations I choose for the Apple products are, in my opinion, the best options for the price, so you'll rarely see me max out or use their, base available options for any of their products. I've come across two really good laptops that rival this Mac Air. The first is the Asus VivoBook S15 S532. Specs are an i7-8565U, a 4-core 8-thread, 1.8 GHz base with a turbo to 4.6 GHz, 8 gigs of DDR4 RAM, a GeForce MX250, 256 gigs of SSD storage, and no Thunderbolt support. Now, here's the thing. The LP and LPDDR means low power, and is effective to, as it suggests, save power. So the CPU on the MacBook Air is absolute garbage, which means it'll bottleneck whatever graphics card you use via Thunderbolt. The only thing the Air has over this VivoBook is that the VivoBook has a lowered 1080p resolution, but it's still an IPS anti-glare display, so it's not like it has a garbage display, it's just not as good as the MacBook Air. It also has a quote-unquote virtual trackpad, which means the trackpad has a display, which is pretty cool. And I'm not complaining, as it's priced at $899.99. If this doesn't impress you, and you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of its thickness, the IdeaPad L340 is the laptop for you. For $959.99, you get an i5 9300H, a 4-core 8-thread 2.4 GHz base clock with a boost clock to 4.1 GHz CPU, a GTX 1050, 16 gigs of DDR4 RAM, 256 gigs of storage, and it also has a 1080p IPS display. Oh, I forgot to mention that the 256 gig SSD is an NVMe SSD, unlike the previous laptops that supported a PCIe SSD. All you're sacrificing is, like I said, that thickness, and you get a beast of a laptop for less than the MacBook Air. The biggest downside is no Thunderbolt, but that's okay, because that has a decent graphics card. Moving on to the MacBook Pro. The MacBook Pro has a 2.6 GHz base clock, which boosts to 4.5 GHz, which is a 6-core 9th Gen i7 CPU, 32 gigs of 2400 MHz RAM, a Radeon Pro 560X with 4 gigs of GDDR5 memory, 256 gigs of SSD storage, and 4 Thunderbolt 3 ports, all for $2,899. Oh, and the display is a beautiful 2880 by 1800 500 nit display. We have two laptops that rival this. The first is the new 2019 Dell XPS 15 7590. This has an i9-9980HK, an 8-core 16-thread 2.4 base clock to 5 GHz boost clocks speed, a GTX 1650, 1 TB of SSD storage, 32 gigs of RAM, and a 15.6-inch 4K IPS touchscreen display. And this is priced at $2,630.99. So let's start this off by comparing the CPUs. Our CPU has 2 more cores and boosts 500 MHz higher. Our laptop has a GTX 1650, which is roughly 1.14 times faster in single precision performance. It is about 2.6 times faster in pixel rate performance and 1.14 times faster in memory bandwidth. Our laptop has nearly 4 times the amount of storage, and not to mention that the display we have is 4K, which is even better than the MacBooks. We also have another incredible laptop, especially for the price it is at. This laptop offers an i7-10100U, a 6-core 12-thread, 1.1 GHz base, but 4.7 GHz boost clock CPU, a GTX 1650, 1 TB of NVMe SSD storage, 32 gigs of 2400 MHz DDR4 RAM, 2 Thunderbolt 3 ports, and a 4K Adobe 100% display. It's got a better CPU, the same amount of RAM, better storage, has Thunderbolt support, a better graphics card, a better display. Oh, and it only costs $1,799. So you can get this laptop, an EVGA SC Ultra RTX 2060 with the Razer Core X. So you got that separate external graphics card for this, if that 1650 doesn't do it for you. And then you can also get 22 9-inch realistic dildo and still have a few cents left over. Let's move on to their phones. Before we get onto the hardware of these machines, we must go over the functionality of iOS. iOS is what I call incredibly obsolete software. JK Apple fanboys, please don't attack me. So the main underlying fact of this is that iOS is more geared to user experience, while Android achieves this experience by giving you user control. For example, iOS has polished their gestures, which makes the user experience immediately better. iOS has, in general, a more minimalistic look, which can make it easier to use in some cases, and makes most things straightforward. It also accomplishes this by being less of an open software. This makes it harder to manipulate certain things in iOS, and much harder to tweak almost anything in iOS, which makes it even easier of an OS to use. A result of this is that iOS users won't be able to search up Spotify Premium for free.apk, which is in an AdFly link, and then proceed to click in the middle of AdFly, which we all know what's gonna happen. And for social interaction, iOS has iMessages, which is an extremely polished messaging platform. It isn't just the green and blue messages, but also the fact that it has a lot of good features such as game pigeon, bubble and screen effects, and a few other stuff. Boom, user experience, not to mention how seamless iMessages works with their Macs. Now lastly, the support for iOS on older Apple devices is impeccable. Not to mention how well it is optimized, which makes sense because only iPhones run iOS, not the gazillion Android devices that run Android. Oh, and another thing I forgot to mention when we were comparing Macs was that the laptops we have can run Hackintosh. So if you want that Apple ecosystem, then you do have the option to do that with some tweaking. This is in comparison to Android, which, as stated, gives you the ability to make your experience via giving you more control. This is shown by it being an open source OS and the fact that you can tweak it to your heart's content. Android has a better voice assistant and so on. The reason why I'm going to say Android is a better OS is not because it is more technologically capable, but because it is more user capable. Okay, now onto the hardware. We're going to be looking at the iPhone XR, iPhone 11, and their flagship iPhone 11 Pro. So let's kick this off with the iPhone XR. So for $649, you get an A12 Bionic chip, 128 gigs of storage, a 2942 milliamp battery, which isn't that bad. See, anything that is above, I'd say like 2600 milliamps for an iPhone is okay because of how iOS is optimized for iPhones. So it's not necessarily a good thing. It has a smaller battery, but it's not too bad. Especially comparison to, like, let's say a 2600 milliamp battery for an Android phone. Google Pixel. It also has 3 gigs of RAM. It's 8.3 millimeters in thickness. It has an IP67 waterproof rating, an A28p 324 ppi LCD display with a notch. Yes, we did go with the 128 gig model because 64 gigs is horrible in 2019. Now, these aren't bad specs, but the rival phone for this is the OnePlus 7T. The OnePlus 7T sports the 855 Plus chip, 128 gigs of storage, a 3800 milliamp battery, 8 gigs of RAM. It has a fingerprint scanner. It's 8.1 millimeters in thickness. It's splash proof, so it doesn't have an IP67 or IP68 rating, but it's splash proof. A 1080p, 402 ppi, 90 Hz fluid AMOLED display with a water drop notch. So start comparing these two. The A55 is about 4% more powerful than the A12 Bionic chip, and the A55 Plus is about 10% faster than the A55, which means that the A55 Plus is quite a bit ahead of the A12 Bionic chip. Next up is that the 7T has a way better battery, more than twice the amount of RAM. It's thinner, has a way better display, and has a considerably smaller notch. And at $599, it makes the iPhone XR a laughingstock. Let's move on to where Apple starts to put up more competition, the iPhone 11. For $749, Apple offers the A13 Bionic chip, 128 gigs of storage, a 3110 milliamp battery, 4 gigs of RAM, 8.3 millimeters in thickness, IP68 waterproof, and an 828p 324 ppi IPS, you guessed it, LCD display. So not too bad for the price, until you realize that the OnePlus 7 Pro exists. For the same price, the specs are a Snapdragon 855, 256 gigs of storage, a 4000 milliamp battery, 3 times the amount of RAM, and a 1440p 550 ppi 90 Hz fluid AMOLED display. The A13 Bionic chip is about 23% faster than the 855, and the iPhone 11 camera is insane. But does this compensate for its absolute shit display, considerably smaller storage, and smaller battery capacity? Well, it depends. If you want a fairly snappy phone that you can use now and then throughout the day to do whatever you want to do and take some good pics along the way, then I'd probably recommend the iPhone 11. However, if you want a phone with a less limited OS and you frequently use your phone, take the occasional photos though, and you don't want your videos to be in the same resolution as a fucking PS2, then I'd recommend the OnePlus 7 Pro for you. Then comes the beast of a machine, the iPhone 11 Pro. The closest phone that can rival this is the S10 Plus in just terms of overall camera quality, display, performance, and so on. The iPhone 11 Pro supports an A13 Bionic chip, 512 gigs of storage, the best camera on the mobile market, 3046 milliamp battery, 4 gigs of RAM, IP68 waterproof rating, 1125p 463 ppi OLED display for $1,349. For $100 less, you can get the S10 Plus, which sports the Exynos 9820, which is roughly 30% slower than the A13 Bionic chip, 512 gigs of storage, a slightly worse camera, 8 gigs of RAM, IP68 waterproof rating, a 1440p 526 ppi dynamic AMOLED display, and AMOLED displays are better than OLED displays, generally speaking, and a 4100 milliamp battery. So if you're willing to sacrifice some performance and a little bit of camera quality for a better display and Android and a larger battery, then sure, you could save the $100 and get the S10 Plus. The smart decision would be to either get the iPhone 11 Pro or wait for phones with the 865 chip to be released, as they're depicted to be around 6% slower than the 813 Bionic chips, which means that Android carriers that have very little bloatware, such as OnePlus, that have options with more RAM, will be strong competitors against the iPhone 11 Pro. But until then, the iPhone 11 Pro reigns king of mobile hardware, but for it to be held back by its software. Lastly, we move on to Apple's impeccable iPad lineup. Let's kick this off with the iPad. For $429, you get 128 gigs of storage, 3 gigs of RAM, a 1620p, 264 ppi, 10.2 inch, 500 nit IPS Retina display, an A10 Fusion chip, and it supports iPad OS. Our competing tablet is the Galaxy Tab S5e, which comes with the Snapdragon 670, which is slightly better than the A10 Fusion, a 1600p 287 ppi 10.5 inch Super AMOLED display, 6 gigs of RAM, and has 128 gigs of storage for $479.99. So the Galaxy Tab's display is on par, if not slightly crispier, with the higher pixel density and smaller screen surface area. It has a faster CPU, twice the RAM, and all this is just priced a little bit more. To be honest, this is the first time I'd say that software-wise, Apple may have a slight edge because of iPad OS, but hardware-wise, the Android variant has the edge. Moving on to the iPad mini, which is the next category. The iPad mini has 256 gigs of storage, Wi-Fi and cellular capabilities, of 1536p 326 ppi 500 nit LED Retina display, and a 12 Bionic chip with 3 gigs of RAM and support for iPad OS for $679. The closest I could find to rival this was the Galaxy Tab S6. The specs are as follows: 256 gigs of storage, 1600p 287 ppi 10.5 inch Super AMOLED display, a Snapdragon 855 paired with 8 gigs of RAM, all for $729.99. The Galaxy Tab has the advantage in sheer power. So if you look at that, then the Galaxy Tab is for you. But for overall value, I'd give the nudge over to the iPad mini. Although it has a lower resolution for its display, and it has slightly less performance as far as raw, CPU power goes. Although it has a lower resolution for its display, it has a much higher pixel density. The A12 Bionic chip is impressive, and iPad OS works well, even with 3 gigs of RAM. Granted, it may be slightly slower than the Galaxy, but it's still the best bang for your buck. Then is the iPad Air, which has 256 gigs of storage, a 10.5-inch 1668p 264 ppi 500 nit display, an A12 Bionic chip, Wi-Fi and cellular networking capabilities for $779. And for this, I'd give the upper edge to the Galaxy Tab S6 we were just talking about. Next is the iPad Pro, which I'm not going to ever go into this because there is no direct competitor to this monster besides the Surface Pro X. But even then, the lighter weight from the iPad Pro makes it a special device, and there's not anything that really can compete with it, which makes the price tag of $1,299 justified. We've concluded that some of their products are quite good and some aren't so good. Next are, for example, their MacBook Air is utter garbage, and their iPhone 11 Pro is quite a marvel. So on our come away, I will tweak the weaker Apple products so that their lineup would be great. First is the MacBook Air. The first step is to get rid of that atrocious 2-core CPU and replace it with an i7-6920HQ, a 4-core 8-thread, 2.9 GHz base, 3.8 GHz boost clock CPU. The next step is to replace the RAM with 8 gigs of 2133 MHz DDR4 RAM. This will make it a good laptop and great for the price. The next is the MacBook Pro. For the configuration that we have, $2,100 would be a good price, and any price in the $1,500 to $2,000 range would make it an insane deal. And for their XR and iPhone 11, my advice is to replace the screens with a higher resolution screen or increase the pixel density. The next step for the iPhone 11 is to make it a single camera shooter to compensate for that better screen. And for their iPads, the best bet is to increase the RAM to 4 gigs on all their products and 6 gigs on their iPad Air. Then it's an impeccable lineup. Apple, you've got the right idea, just think differently and you'll have solid products.